Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world that has been almost entirely erased from the history books, not because it wasn't interesting, but because nobody thought it was worth writing down. We're talking about the women who did not get married in 1950s America. The ones who didn't get the white dress, the station wagon, the husband who left his briefcase by the door every evening at 6. The ones who went to work on Monday, came home to a one-bedroom apartment, cooked dinner for one, and somehow had to explain this arrangement to every single person they knew for the rest of their lives. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere, truly heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and this one is for you. Your suggestions are what keep this channel alive and moving, and I mean that. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a strange kind of magic to see someone in New Zealand and someone in Ohio, both horizontal, in the dark at the same time. And if you haven't yet, the channel is now on Spotify. The link is in the description so you can drift off to this wherever you do your best not sleeping. Now, dim those lights, flip on a fan, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let's ease into it. Because here's what I want you to think about. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a single woman in the 1950s? Not the glamorous Hollywood version with the cigarette holder and the devastating cheekbones, but the real version, the secretary who ate lunch at her desk, the school teacher who was legally required to quit if she got married, the woman at the end of the street who everyone called a spinster like it was her actual name. Did she own things? Did she have friends? Was she allowed to get a bank loan? Or did she need a man to co-sign for her own money? What did she do on a Saturday night when the whole country seemed to be paired off and barbecuing? Could she travel alone without being considered suspicious? Could she go to a restaurant without someone feeling sorry for her? Was she happy? Was she lonely? Was she actually, quietly, having a better time than anyone admitted? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1953. You are unmarried, female, and 28 years old, which means that according to polite society, you are approximately 4 years past your expiration date. You have a job, an apartment, and an opinion, all of which are considered slightly alarming. Good luck. Let's start at the very beginning, which is the name. In 1950s, America, an unmarried woman over a certain age, and that age was somewhere around 23, 24 if people were being generous, was called a spinster. Not a bachelor. Not a free agent. A spinster. The word came from the old practice of unmarried women spinning thread at home, because that was the only thing anyone could imagine them doing that didn't involve a husband. By the time you were living it, the word carried a very specific emotional weight, part pity, part suspicion, part polite social horror. Someone would say it at a party just slightly too loud, and the room would briefly rearrange itself around the information, the way people do when they hear something they've decided is a little sad. You were not a woman who hadn't married yet. You were a woman who hadn't married full stop, the yet having quietly expired somewhere around your last birthday. And the word followed you. It appeared on no official documents, held no legal weight, and yet it was somehow everywhere, in the way your mother introduced you at church, in the way the neighbor tilted her head when she asked about your weekend, in the way certain invitations arrived, addressed to you and your guest in a tone that suggested the guest slot was more of a polite formality than a genuine expectation. Spinster wasn't just a label. It was a social weather system. You walked through it every day. The bachelor, by contrast, was doing fine. The bachelor was a catch. He was independent, discerning, perhaps a little mysterious. People assumed he simply hadn't found the right woman yet, and that when he did, it would be his choice and his triumph, and everyone would celebrate accordingly. You, on the other hand, were assumed to have been passed over. The framing was passive. Something had happened to you, or rather, something had failed to happen, and the failure was yours. Nobody questioned this logic, because the logic was invisible. It was just the air. What made it particularly exhausting was that the label arrived before you had formed any opinion about your own situation. At 25, you were still figuring things out, still building a career, still working out who you were in the morning before anyone else was awake. and the culture had already filed you under a heading that carried centuries of dusty connotations. Spinster, leftover, the one who remained. Some women fought it. Some women wore it like armor, daring anyone to make it mean something smaller than they were. A few, mostly in cities, mostly in circles where other women were doing the same thing, started constructing an alternative story, not the tragic one, but a quieter, more functional one, where not being married was simply a description rather than a verdict. This was brave. It required ignoring a considerable amount of ambient noise. Most women, though, just lived alongside the label the way you live alongside a noise you can't locate, always there, not quite loud enough to address, just slightly too persistent to forget. You went to work, you paid your rent, you had dinner with friends, and somewhere at the edge of every social interaction was the word, sitting in the corner of the room like an uninvited guest who had decided the party was about them. The irony, of course, was that the women being called spinsters were often the most competent people in any given room. They had to be. They were supporting themselves entirely, navigating a world that had not been designed for them, making decisions that men with wives to consult didn't have to make alone. But competence wasn't the story anyone was interested in. The story was the absence of a ring. And in 1950s America, that story had only one official interpretation, and it wasn't a flattering one. Finding somewhere to live when you were a single woman in the 1950s was its own particular adventure, and not the good kind. Landlords were openly permitted, legally, socially, enthusiastically, to refuse to rent to single women on the grounds that a woman living alone was either a moral hazard or simply a very bad financial bet. The logic was that a woman had no business signing a lease because she didn't really have income in the serious, grown-up sense of the word, and also because a woman living alone in an apartment was sending some kind of message, and the message was unclear but definitely troubling. You could try rooming houses, which were specifically designed for single working women and which operated something like a dormitory crossed with a surveillance state, with curfews, no male visitor rules, and a landlady who had opinions about the length of your skirts and strong feelings about noise after 9. The rooming house was a world unto itself. It was often a large Victorian house or a converted brownstone, carved up into small single rooms with a shared bathroom on each floor, and a parlour downstairs where, in theory, residents could socialise and, in practice, mostly avoided each other with the focused determination of people who have already spent all day being polite to colleagues. The landlady was the central figure. She was usually a widow, usually formidable, and she ran the house with a combination of genuine maternal concern and the managerial philosophy of a mid-level military official. She kept a logbook. She knew when you came in. She had opinions about your gentlemen callers, even if you didn't have any gentlemen callers, in which case she had different but equally firm opinions. The rules were not subtle. Most rooming houses had a curfew, 10 o'clock, 10:30 on weekends if she was feeling magnanimous. Men were not permitted above the ground floor. Some houses required residents to eat dinner together, a policy that was framed as community and functioned as monitoring. You signed a contract that was less a lease than a behavioural agreement, and breaking it meant finding somewhere else to live, which was not easy, which was the entire point. If you had a reliable job and a reference from a previous landlady and a manner that suggested you were not going to cause problems, and problems, in this context, meant anything from loud visitors to the wrong kind of independence, you could eventually find a proper apartment, not easily. The landlord would ask about your employment. He would ask, often directly, whether you were planning to get married soon, because if you were, there was a vacancy waiting for a couple, and he didn't want to hold the unit for a woman who was about to become half of a household that could afford something better. You would answer, carefully. You would provide references. You would be pleasant and competent and demonstrate in as many ways as possible that you were a safe financial bet, despite the structural evidence the era had arranged against you. And eventually, if you were persistent and lucky and living in a city rather than a small town, you would get the apartment, your name on the lease, your key in the lock. A one-bedroom on the 4th floor with a radiator that clanged at 3 in the morning and a view of the building across the alley, and a kitchen just large enough to cook in, if you didn't mind turning sideways. And you would stand in it the first evening, with your one suitcase and your small collection of books, and it would be yours, entirely, legally, completely yours, in a way that almost nothing else in the social architecture of 1950s America was arranged to let it be. That feeling was worth the landlord's interrogation. Just barely, but worth it. If you were a single woman in the 1950s who needed to support yourself, and you did, because no husband was going to appear and do it for you, your career options were helpfully narrow. You could be a secretary, a nurse, a school teacher, or a telephone operator. That was largely the list. Not because women were incapable of doing other things, which they obviously were, but because the working world had made a series of quiet, structural decisions about which jobs counted as women's work. And those decisions were enforced with the cheerful certainty of people who had never once been asked to question them. Department stores had entire floors of women doing clerical work. Banks had women at the teller windows and men in the offices behind them. The divide was so consistent it barely registered as a choice. It was just how things were, like the weather or the price of milk. The help-wanted sections of newspapers in the 1950s were sorted by gender, not subtly. Literally. Number, help wanted, male on one side, help wanted, female on the other, two entirely separate economies printed side by side on the same page, as if this were the most natural organizational principle imaginable. The men's side advertised management positions, engineering roles, sales jobs with commission structures and career trajectories. The women's side advertised typing, filing, telephone answering, retail and light assembly work. If you were a woman with a college degree, and by 1950, around a third of college students were women, you took your diploma and you applied for the secretary position, because that was what was available. The telephone operator was a particular institution of the era. Entire buildings full of women sat at switchboards, connecting calls with the mechanical precision of a human router, using their voices to smooth the daily communications of businesses that would have collapsed without them, and earning wages that reflected none of this. The work required patience, dexterity, a pleasant voice, and the ability to manage rudeness from callers with an equanimity that should have been classified as a professional skill and compensated accordingly. It was not. Department store work was another pillar of the women's employment landscape. You stood on your feet for 8 hours. You smiled. You helped women who were shopping for households. You would never have fine blouses in their size and kitchenware for their kitchens and gifts for their husbands. The work was relentlessly social, required genuine skill in reading people and managing interactions, and paid modestly in exchange for all of it. And if you had ambitions beyond these options, if you had studied chemistry or law or economics or architecture, the path was not impossible, exactly, but it was narrow, and it was lined on both sides with people who thought you were probably confused about something. Women who entered male-dominated professions in the 1950s did so by being excellent enough that refusal became difficult to justify, and even then the justifications were creative. You were taking a job from a man who needed to support a family. You would leave when you got married. You made the other employees uncomfortable. You were good, yes, but not that good, not management good, not the kind of good that came with a title on the door. What the era did not account for, and what became apparent slowly and then rapidly over the following 2 decades, was that the women who stayed in those narrow lanes were getting very good at a great many things that nobody was officially crediting them for. They were running offices and keeping hospitals functioning and educating entire generations of children, and they were doing it on wages that assumed they were temporary and in conditions that assumed they would be grateful. Some of them were, some of them were not. Most of them just kept going, because the alternative was not going, and that was not a real alternative at all. Let's say you got the job. Wonderful. Now let's talk about what they paid you for it, which was considerably less than they paid the man sitting 2 desks over doing the same work. And this was not a secret, a conspiracy, or something anyone was particularly embarrassed about. It was policy. Many companies openly maintained separate pay scales for men and women on the stated logic that a man needed to support a family and a woman did not, even if the woman in question was, in fact, supporting herself entirely and also possibly sending money home to her mother. Your paycheck was not a living wage in the way a man's paycheck was a living wage. It was a supplementary income, a pin money situation, something to keep you occupied between now and the wedding, which everyone assumed was coming even when all available evidence suggested it was not. The numbers were stark. Women in the 1950s earned, on average, about 60 cents for every dollar a man earned for equivalent work. This was not a secret statistic discovered after the fact by indignant historians. It was known. 8. It was discussed in the same casual tone in which people discuss train schedules or import tariffs, as a feature of the landscape rather than a political choice. Employers justified it through several lines of reasoning, all of which were flawed and none of which were examined critically in polite company. Men had families to support. Women would leave when they married. Women were less serious about their careers. Women were suited to jobs that were, by nature, worth less, which was a useful piece of circular logic that could be deployed indefinitely. What this meant in practical terms was that you budgeted with a precision that would have impressed an accountant. Rent took the biggest share. Then groceries, calculated carefully, the cheaper cuts, the seasonal vegetables, the one luxury item per week that you permitted yourself, because otherwise the whole arrangement felt too bleak to sustain. You kept a careful eye on your winter coat situation, because a good coat lasted 5 years and a bad coat lasted 2, and you could not always afford the good coat. You did your own laundry. You cut your own hair sometimes, or found a friend who was good at it. You knew exactly how much was in your account at any given moment because the margin for error was thin and you had learned, usually once and memorably, what happened when you miscalculated. The irony of all this financial precision was that it made single working women in the 1950s considerably more financially competent than the culture gave them credit for. You were managing a household, your expenses, your planning, entirely alone on an income designed for someone whose survival was supposed to be someone else's problem. Men of the same era who were supporting families on similar incomes had wives managing the domestic economics, stretching the grocery budget, tracking the household accounts. You were doing both halves of that equation by yourself, and nobody was particularly impressed by this because it wasn't supposed to be happening in the first place. The Equal Pay Act wouldn't arrive until 1963, and even then it would take decades of enforcement, litigation, and cultural shift to produce anything resembling parity. In the 1950s, you simply worked with what you had, which was less than you were worth, and you made it stretch, which required skills nobody was officially teaching and nobody was officially acknowledging. And you did it every week, quietly, on a Tuesday morning when the paycheck arrived and you did the mental arithmetic and put the envelope in your purse and went back to work. Because what else were you going to do? Here is a fun fact about 1950s America that will make you want to lie very still and breathe slowly. A single woman could technically have a bank account, but getting a credit card, a loan, or any financial product that required a credit assessment was a different matter entirely. Banks routinely required a male cosigner for women applying for loans, on the reasoning that a woman's financial reliability was essentially borrowed from a man, a father, a brother, a husband, anyone with the right chromosomes and a steady income. If you were a single woman trying to buy a car, rent a decent apartment, or obtain a mortgage on your own, you were navigating a system that had been built around the assumption that you would shortly become someone's wife and that your financial life would then become his problem to manage. Until that happened, you were essentially on probation. The credit card was a relatively new institution in the 1950s, and its early culture was almost exclusively male. Diners Club, launched in 1950, was aimed at businessmen. American Express followed in a similar vein. Women were not the target market, and when women applied independently, they frequently encountered the cosigner requirement: bring a man who will vouch for you, bring a man who will be responsible if you fail, bring a man to stand between you and the financial institution and translate your request into a language the bank could understand. End quote. The fact that you had been employed for 4 years and had never missed a payment on anything in your life was noted but not considered sufficient. If you needed to buy a car, and in the increasingly suburban 1950s, a car was moving from luxury to practical necessity, you went to the dealership and you dealt with a salesman who talked to you the way people talk to someone they expect to bring a husband back next time. The financing conversation was brief and discouraging. You could pay cash, which required having saved the full amount on a secretary's salary, a feat that took years and considerable discipline. Or you could find a male co-signer, which required having a man in your life willing to attach his credit to your purchase and accept a degree of legal responsibility for your financial decisions. This was both financially and socially complicated in ways that the bank did not appear to find troubling. The mortgage situation was grimmer still. Women were not supposed to own houses alone. This was not written into law in most places, but it was baked into lending practice so thoroughly that it functioned as law. A single woman's income, already discounted by the gender pay gap, was viewed as unstable, likely to disappear upon marriage. The mortgage would outlast the income, better to decline. Better to wait until she had a husband whose income could be trusted to persist. What this created, practically, was a class of financially competent women who were locked out of the wealth-building mechanisms available to men of equivalent or lower ability. You saved. You were careful. You were better with money than many of the men who were being handed credit lines. And you watched the financial infrastructure of the country arrange itself around assumptions about your life that bore no particular relationship to your actual life. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which would prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex in credit decisions, wouldn't arrive until 1974. Until then, you brought a co-signer, or you paid cash, or you did without, and you noted, privately, the exact shape of the wall. Saturday nights in 1950s, America were culturally coded as couples' territory with the ferocity of a legally binding contract. The movies were for couples. The drive-ins were especially for couples. Dinner at a nice restaurant was for couples, and a woman eating alone at a restaurant was either waiting for someone, recently widowed, or the subject of low-grade ambient pity from the staff, who would seat her somewhere near the back, where her solitude wouldn't upset the general mood. If you were single and female, and you wanted to go out on a Saturday night, your options were to organize a group of other single women and go out together, which was fine but carried its own social freight, or to stay home, which was also fine but required a personality robust enough to resist the cultural message that staying home alone on a Saturday was evidence of a life gone sideways. The group solution was the most common and, in practice, often the most genuinely enjoyable. You called your friends, you made arrangements, you went to the movies and sat in the middle of the row and ate popcorn and had opinions about the film afterward over coffee at the diner. And the evening was perfectly good, and you knew it was perfectly good, and there was still a tiny corner of it that the culture had poisoned slightly, because the culture was very good at that. The diner was the great leveler of single women's social lives. It was cheap, it was open late, it was staffed by women who had been on their feet since 6 in the morning and had no patience for social performance, and it would seat you alone at the counter without commentary. You could nurse a cup of coffee for 45 minutes and read your book, and nobody asked you anything except whether you wanted a refill. In a social landscape that often required you to explain or justify your presence, the diner counter was a rare pocket of unconditional occupancy. You were there. You had ordered. The transaction was complete. Dancing was complicated. Ballrooms and dance halls were couple-oriented by design. You came with someone, you danced with someone. The architecture of the evening was built around the pair. Some dance halls had ticket systems where men could buy dances with women who sat along the wall, a practice that was both economically practical and socially loaded in ways that most women found either fine or humiliating depending on their disposition. If you liked to dance and you were good at it, you could have a genuinely pleasant evening this way. If you found the transactional quality of it uncomfortable, you could stay home, which brought you back to the original problem. What single women in the 1950s were quietly developing, under the pressure of these limited options, was a social creativity that went largely unacknowledged. They organized. They created their own occasions. They had dinner parties in apartments, not much bigger than a decent-sized closet, cooking elaborate meals on 2-burner stoves and seating 8 people at a table meant for 4, and making it work through the application of folding chairs and goodwill. They went to lectures. They went to gallery openings. They found the cheap concerts and the free events in the park and the bookshop readings that cost nothing and provided more to talk about than most Saturday nights at a restaurant twice the price. The cultural message was that their social lives were a consolation prize for the real social life they didn't have. The reality was somewhat more interesting. They were building something in those cramped apartments and diners and group movie outings, a social world made of friendship rather than partnership, chosen rather than assigned. It was not the world the magazines had designed for them. It was frequently better. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, the 4th of July. Any occasion that required you to appear at a table surrounded by your extended family was, for the single woman of the 1950s, an experience that combined genuine warmth with the low-level psychological pressure of a performance review. Your aunts had opinions. Your mother had concerns she expressed as questions. Your cousins had husbands who looked at you with the particular mild pity of people who considered themselves to have solved a problem you had failed to solve. Someone would always ask, and by ask I mean ask with a tone, whether you were seeing anyone. Someone else would always mention a man, a colleague's son, a neighbour's nephew, a man from church who was very nice and wasn't getting any younger either. The subtext of every holiday gathering was a gentle but sustained collective effort to fix something that the family had decided was broken, even if you had not entirely agreed to that framing. The Thanksgiving table was a special arena. You arrived. You had brought something, a pie, a dish, something that demonstrated you were capable of domestic production even in the absence of a domestic situation. You sat down. The table was organized, as family tables tend to be, according to a hierarchy that was partly affectionate and partly brutal. The married couples sat together. The children occupied one end of the table where spillage was expected and forgiven. And you sat where you were placed, which was often next to the uncle who asked awkward questions and the cousin who was also still single and with whom you were therefore assumed to have a natural kinship, as if singleness were a personality type that gravitated toward itself. Your mother's concern was the purest and the most exhausting. It came from love, which made it impossible to simply dismiss. She had organized her own life around marriage and family, had built everything she valued within that structure, and she could not see outside it clearly enough to understand that the structure was not universal. When she asked about men, she was not trying to wound you. She was trying, in the only vocabulary she had, to express that she wanted you to be happy and that in her understanding, happy required a husband, and so the husband was the thing she kept returning to, year after year, at every holiday table, in every phone call, with the patient persistence of someone who had decided that the right answer would eventually arrive if she just kept asking the question. The cousins who had married were sometimes kind and sometimes competitive, in a way they couldn't quite admit to themselves. The ones who were having a difficult time in their marriages had a particular quality of observation when they looked at you, a brief flicker of something complicated that was gone before it could be named. You noticed it. You said nothing. This was one of several things you said nothing about at holiday dinners, a discipline that grew more practiced with each year. What made the family holiday genuinely valuable, underneath all of this, was that it was still family. These were the people who had known you before you were the unmarried one, who remembered you as a child, who loved you in the imperfect and persistent way that families love, not elegantly, not efficiently, but with a continuity that nothing else really replicated. You came back every year. You brought the pie. You answered the questions with patience, and sometimes with humour that deflected the discomfort for everyone. And after dinner you sat in the living room and talked about other things. And for a few hours it was just the family, gathered, warm, imperfect, and entirely yours. That part was worth the table. In the great suburban neighbourhoods of 1950s America, where the houses were new and the lawns were green, and everyone knew each other's business, with the thoroughness of a small-town census, The single woman who lived alone was a neighborhood feature that required interpretation. You were noticed. Not maliciously, mostly, but consistently. You came and went without a husband. You had friends over, sometimes in the evenings. You didn't have children in the yard making the reassuring noise of a normal domestic situation. The neighbors developed theories. Some of them decided you were sad, which they expressed through casseroles and slightly too long eye contact. Some of them decided you were mysterious, which they expressed by watching your windows. Some of them decided you were a cautionary tale, which they expressed by pointing you out to their daughters in a tone that made the lesson self-evident. The neighbor across the street was your most committed observer. She had positioned her kitchen window, or perhaps her entire life, with a sight line to your front door, and she tracked your comings and goings with a diligence that would have impressed a private investigator. She was not hostile. She was, in her own estimation, concerned. She would mention at the block association meeting that your gutters needed attention, which was true and kind, and also a way of flagging that she had been watching your house carefully enough to notice the gutters. She brought food when she thought you looked thin. She mentioned her son, or her husband's colleague, or the new man at church, with a regularity that suggested she had scheduled these mentions in advance. The suburb was built on a social logic of pairs. Houses were designed for families. The neighborhood association was organized around the assumption that every household contained a husband and a wife, and the wife handled certain things, and the husband handled other things, and together they produced the unit that made the street cohere. You were a unit of one, and while nobody said this was wrong, exactly, it was clearly irregular, and irregular things attracted attention in environments built on regularity. What the neighbors rarely considered was that you had organized your household with the competence of someone who had no backup. Your lawn was cut because you cut it. Your gutters were eventually cleaned because you either climbed the ladder yourself or arranged to have it done, either of which required more practical initiative than watching someone else do it. Your house was maintained by your own decisions and your own labor, which was not the model the suburb had intended, but was, functionally, perfectly workable. The children on the street found you interesting for entirely different reasons than their parents did. You had no bedtime to enforce on them, no dinner schedule to protect, no parent logic filtering your interactions. You talked to them as people, answered their questions directly, and had a house that contained books and interesting objects, and the faint atmosphere of a life organized around individual choice rather than institutional routine. The neighborhood children spent more time at your kitchen table than their parents would have predicted, and less time than you sometimes wished. They were, in their uncomplicated way, the neighbors who asked the fewest questions and offered the most uncomplicated company, two qualities that, by November of any given year, you had learned to genuinely appreciate. One of the great practical solutions available to single women in the 1950s was the roommate, and entire social ecosystems formed around this arrangement. Rooming houses gave way to shared apartments where 2 or 3 or 4 women split the rent, the groceries, the single bathroom, and the ongoing low-grade diplomatic negotiations of shared domestic life. These arrangements were sometimes friendships of extraordinary depth and duration, women who navigated careers, heartbreaks, bad landlords, and the general texture of adult life together for years, sometimes decades, with a closeness that the culture around them refused to name as anything other than a temporary measure. And sometimes the arrangement was purely economic, a cold calculation involving proximity to work and the price of eggs. 2 strangers sharing a kitchen with the polite wariness of people who have agreed not to discuss their feelings. The apartment search, when conducted as a pair, was marginally more successful than the solo version. 2 salaries presented a slightly more convincing financial case to skeptical landlords, and the moral hazard calculation, the vague concern about what a single woman alone in an apartment was signaling, was at least partially mitigated by the presence of another woman, as if 2 women being sensible in the same apartment cancelled out whatever the landlord had been worried about. You found the place. You signed the lease. You stood in the empty rooms with your future roommate and discussed who got which bedroom with the careful diplomacy of two people who didn't know each other well enough yet, to be honest, and knew this negotiation would set a tone. The bathroom was the first test. There is no more honest laboratory for human compatibility than a shared bathroom between two women who have to be at work by 8:30. Schedules were established. Shelf allocations were discussed. The question of whether one person's extensive collection of hair products constituted a shared resource or a private possession with territorial boundaries was resolved or not resolved in the first 2 weeks. If you survived the bathroom, you would probably be fine. The kitchen produced a different set of negotiations. Some roommates divided the groceries completely and maintained separate shelves in the refrigerator with the boundary clarity of a small international treaty. Others pooled everything and cooked together, which produced more warmth and more conflict in roughly equal measure. The question of whose turn it was to buy the dish soap was raised in various apartments across American cities with a frequency and emotional charge that bore no proportional relationship to the cost of dish soap. What the roommate arrangement produced, at its best, was something the culture hadn't quite planned for, a unit of mutual support that functioned like a family without being one. You knew when the other person was having a terrible week. You covered for each other, fed each other, sat with each other on Sunday evenings when the combination of Monday approaching and the ambient cultural messaging about your lives was louder than usual. You had someone to tell things to. You had someone who remembered what you'd been worrying about last Tuesday and asked about it this Tuesday. In a social landscape that organized most of its support structures around marriage and family, this was not nothing. It was, in many cases, everything. And it was called a temporary arrangement, a practical solution, a stepping stone, because the era did not have a better name for it. And sometimes the thing you can't name is the thing you need most. If you were a single woman in the 1950s and you were ambitious, if you were good at your job, visibly good, better than the men in the room good, you encountered a ceiling so low it was practically a floor. Promotion into management was not available to women in most industries, not officially forbidden but practically impossible, in the way that many things were practically impossible without ever being officially forbidden. You could be excellent, you could be indispensable, you could train the man who was then promoted over you and smile at his going-away party and bring a cake. This was not considered ironic. It was considered the natural order of professional life, and women who objected to it were considered difficult, which was a word that in 1950s corporate America meant approximately the same thing as unemployable. The mechanism was simple and it was everywhere. You were hired for a position with a ceiling. The ceiling was not posted on the job description. That would have been embarrassingly direct. But it was understood by everyone in the building, including the men who benefited from it, and the women who ran into it. A woman could be a secretary but not an office manager, even if she had been running the office for 6 years and the official office manager could not locate the filing system without her guidance. She could be a nurse but not a physician, a teacher but not a principal, a copywriter but not a creative director. The title was always one level below the title that came with actual institutional power, and this was maintained with the calm persistence of a system that had decided it was common sense. What made this particularly difficult to argue against was that it was rarely explicit. Nobody sent a memo saying women were ineligible for promotion. The decision was made in rooms you weren't in by people who liked you fine in your current role and simply did not think of you when the management position opened up. It didn't feel like discrimination from the inside of those rooms. It felt like practicality. Women would leave when they married. Women didn't want the responsibility. Women were better with people, more suited to support roles, happier doing the work that kept everything running rather than the work that got the credit for it. These were not malicious thoughts. They were assumptions, baked in deeply enough that the people holding them could not have located them if asked to try. Some women navigated this by becoming so essential that bypassing them became genuinely difficult. They accumulated expertise so specific, relationships so foundational, institutional knowledge so deep that the organization could not function at its current level without them. This gave them a kind of informal power, not the power of the title, but the power of the person who knows where everything is and how everything works, and whose quiet judgment keeps the whole structure from occasionally falling over. It was real power. It was not acknowledged as power. It was called being good at your job, which it was, and left at that. Others found paths through unusual doors, small companies where the rules were less rigid, non-profit organizations that were more flexible about structure, fields like social work and librarianship and education, where women had been present long enough that female leadership was at least conceivable. These were not glamorous routes to authority, but they were routes, and the women who took them built careers of genuine depth and reach. They ran institutions. They shaped policy. They did it without the titles that would have come automatically to men of equivalent ability, and they did it anyway, because they had decided that the ceiling was someone else's problem and they had work to do. Going to the doctor as a single woman in the 1950s was an experience that required a certain tolerance for being discussed rather than consulted. Doctors, almost exclusively male, had opinions about single women's health that went somewhat beyond the purely medical. If you reported anxiety, you were probably lonely. If you reported fatigue, you were probably unfulfilled. If you reported anything that could be connected, even tangentially, to your unmarried status, the prescription was likely to involve the suggestion that marriage and family would sort things out in a way that aspirin simply couldn't. The idea that a woman's body was a waiting room for motherhood was embedded so deeply in medical culture that it barely registered as an idea. It was just the shape of the room. Gynecological care for single women was complicated by the assumption that unmarried women were either not sexually active, in which case they didn't need it, or were sexually active in a way that was their own embarrassing problem. The waiting room itself was a social experience. You sat among the pregnant women and the mothers with children on their laps, and the older women, accompanied by husbands, and the receptionist noted your status on the intake form with a neutrality that was itself a kind of comment: single, no next of kin listed. The form had not been designed with you in mind, which was true of most forms in the 1950s, and you filled in what you could and left the rest blank and handed it back across the desk. The consultation was where things got interesting. A good doctor, and there were good doctors, thorough and genuinely curious and interested in the actual patient rather than the demographic category, would ask questions and listen to the answers and treat your body as the specific and complicated organism it was. A less good doctor, and the odds were not entirely in your favor, would conduct the appointment as though your health complaints were symptoms of a larger social condition that a husband would resolve. Headaches? Stress from living alone? Insomnia? Anxiety about the future? Weight loss? Not eating properly? Without someone to cook for? The diagnosis arrived before the questions did, and the questions were arranged to confirm it. Contraception was its own minefield. Birth control existed, the diaphragm had been available for decades, but obtaining it as an unmarried woman required navigating a medical culture that considered the request either unnecessary, since you weren't supposed to be sexually active, or morally problematic, since you were. Many doctors simply refused to prescribe contraception to unmarried women. Some would agree only if you implied that marriage was imminent, a fiction that required maintenance across multiple appointments. The pill would arrive in 1960, but it would take years and a series of legal battles before it was available to unmarried women without the same obstacle course of assumptions and refusals. What single women developed, in response to all of this, was a fluency in medical self-advocacy that their married counterparts were less often required to exercise. You learned to describe your symptoms precisely enough that there was no interpretive space for the loneliness diagnosis. You learned which doctors listened and which ones didn't, and you shared this information with your friends the way people share information about good restaurants, with the specificity of people who have learned through experience that the alternative is considerably worse. You showed up prepared. You brought notes. You asked follow-up questions with the calm persistence of someone who had decided that her body was her business and that the doctor's office was a service she was entitled to use correctly. It was exhausting. It was also, given the options, the only workable approach. A woman travelling alone in 1950s, America occupied a peculiar social category that hovered somewhere between admirable and suspicious, depending entirely on who was doing the evaluating. Train travel was manageable, airlines were newer, and carried a certain glamour that made a woman traveling alone feel slightly less anomalous, like she was a character in a movie about herself. But hotels were a problem. Many hotels would not give a room to a single woman without verification that she was there for a legitimate, explainable reason, because the alternative was too troubling to contemplate in the lobby. A woman alone in a hotel room was either a traveling saleswoman, which was unusual enough to require explanation, or something the front desk staff preferred not to think about while checking in the evening couples. The train was the most democratic of the travel options, and single women used it extensively. You bought your ticket, you found your seat, and the train moved through the landscape with a democratic indifference to your marital status that was genuinely refreshing. The dining car required a brief negotiation. Single diners were often seated with other single travelers, a practice that was partly practical and partly a gentle herding of the socially irregular into a manageable corner of the car. But it was manageable, and the food was reliable, and the landscape outside the window was available to everyone regardless of who they had or hadn't married. The bus was cheaper and less romantic, and absolutely no one was pretending otherwise. Greyhound routes connected cities through the middle of the country with a thoroughness that the train lines didn't always match. And the buses filled with soldiers and students and working people and women travelling alone with a practicality that precluded most of the social performance required on more aspirational forms of transport. You ate your sandwich from a paper bag, you read your book. Nobody seated next to you was impressed, and you were not required to impress them, and this was its own kind of freedom. Flying was expensive and therefore selective, but it had a quality that single women who could afford it found genuinely useful. On an aeroplane, nobody knew anything about you. You were a passenger. You were going somewhere. The airline stewardesses, young, uniformed, rigorously presented, treated every passenger with the same calibrated pleasantness, and the altitude created a temporary suspension of normal social categories that felt, for the duration of the flight, like a small holiday from being the unmarried one. The challenge on arrival was the hotel. Some hotels simply would not book single women, particularly in the evening, on the reasoning that a woman arriving alone at night was either in trouble or causing it, and the management would prefer not to be involved either way. Women travelling for work, the journalists, the saleswomen, the academics attending conferences, learned to book in advance, to arrive during business hours if possible, and to have professional documentation ready to present at the front desk as evidence of legitimacy. The letter from the employer, the conference registration, the business card that translated your presence into a category the hotel could process without discomfort. What all of this created, in the women who travelled despite it, was a navigational competence that went well beyond reading a map. You knew which hotels had policies that were workable. You knew which cities were easier. You kept a mental list of the restaurants where a woman eating alone was treated as a customer rather than a curiosity. You built the infrastructure of solo travel out of accumulated information and passed it along to friends who were planning their own trips. A quiet network of practical knowledge circulating among women who had decided that the world was available to them and that the logistics were simply a problem to be solved. School teaching was one of the few professions in 1950s America where a single woman was not just tolerated, but actively preferred, right up until the moment she got married, at which point many school districts required her to resign. The logic, such as it was, held that a married woman had a husband and therefore didn't need the income, and also that a pregnant teacher was somehow inappropriate for a classroom, in ways that nobody spelled out clearly but everyone understood implicitly. So you had this strange professional window. Single women were the ideal teachers, steady and dedicated, unencumbered by the domestic obligations that might interfere with lesson planning. And then, the moment they married, the window slammed shut. Many women taught for years, quietly, with great competence, and then vanished from the profession at the altar. The classroom was your domain in a way that almost nothing else in 1950s professional life was designed to be. You closed the door, and you were the authority. You made the decisions about how to organize the day, how to explain the concept, how to handle the child in the third row who was clearly having a difficult morning. You were trusted, within those four walls, with the intellectual and social development of 30 children, which was an enormous responsibility, treated as a modest one, because it was women's work, and women's work was by definition modest, regardless of its actual scope. The pay was low. Teaching salaries in the 1950s were not the wages of people considered to be doing important and skilled work. They were the wages of people considered to be doing something natural, something that came easily to women by virtue of their nurturing instincts, and therefore something that didn't require the kind of financial recognition that work requiring genuine expertise commanded. That this framing was both insulting and incorrect was apparent to most teachers and irrelevant to most school boards. What teaching offered that was genuinely valuable and that many single women recognized and chose deliberately was stability and structure and a social position that was clean and comprehensible. A teacher was respectable. Her singleness, within the professional context of the school, was not strange. It was traditional, in fact, since the unmarried schoolteacher was a figure with roots stretching back through American educational history. You occupied a role with clear social meaning. You were doing something the community understood and valued, even if the valuation didn't translate into adequate wages. The summer was a complicated gift. 3 months off, theoretically, although most teachers spent significant portions of it preparing for the following year, attending professional development, and managing the particular exhaustion that accumulated over 9 months of being responsible for other people's children. But there was time, genuinely unscheduled time, that the other women in the narrow careers available to you did not have. Some teachers travelled, some took courses. Some simply rested in a way that the year did not permit. The summer was yours in a way that the school year wasn't, and for women whose entire professional lives were organised around service to others, this pocket of autonomy was not a small thing. And then she got married, and she left, and the class got a new teacher in September, and the children adapted because children adapt. And the woman who had spent 4 years learning exactly how to reach the particular mixture of students in that particular room went home to be a wife. This was the deal. Most women understood it going in. Some of them found, once they were on the other side of it, that they missed the classroom with a specificity that surprised them. Not the abstract idea of teaching, but the actual daily particular work of it, which had been theirs and was no longer traded in at the altar along with the name. Nursing offered something slightly different from the other acceptable careers for single women in the 1950s. A kind of institutional structure that felt almost like a vocation, complete with uniforms, hierarchies, rules, and the particular dignity of doing work that was visibly, undeniably important. Hospitals ran on nurses. Everyone knew this, including the doctors who acted like they didn't. The nursing profession in the post-war era was almost entirely female, largely single. Many hospitals required nurses to be unmarried or to resign upon marriage, and organized around a culture of discipline and shared purpose that created genuine community. Women lived in nurses' residences, ate together, worked brutal hours together, and formed friendships of the kind that only emerge from shared exhaustion and the regular proximity of other people's emergencies. The uniform was its own psychology. You put it on in the morning and you became, in a specific and functional sense, your role. The white dress, the cap, the shoes that prioritized 12 hours of standing over every other consideration, they erased individual variation in a way that was both constraining and, in the context of a hospital floor that required coordinated action from multiple people under significant pressure, genuinely useful. You were identifiable. You were legible. And quote, patients knew what you were and what you could do for them, and in moments of fear and pain, legibility was a form of comfort. The work was relentless and it was real. You were present at the edges of life in a way that most jobs in the 1950s did not require and could not provide. You saw people at their most frightened and their most relieved and their most stripped of the social performance that ordinary life required. You held hands in the night. You made clinical decisions under time pressure, then deferred to doctors who had arrived 30 seconds ago and knew less about the patient than you did after 3 days of continuous care. You documented. You advocated. You translated medical information into language that families could absorb while they were terrified. None of this appeared clearly in the job description. The nurse's residence was a world within a world. Women lived in small rooms in buildings attached to or adjacent to the hospital, a proximity that was practical and also reflected the assumption that nurses' lives were essentially continuous with their work, that the line between the professional and the personal was thin enough to be treated as optional. The residence had its own social life. Friendships formed over shared meals and late-night decompression sessions after difficult shifts. The particular intimacy of people who had all just been through something and needed to sit with someone who understood what it had been. These friendships were often the deepest ones in a nurse's life, formed under conditions that produced loyalty quickly. The hierarchy was strict, and it was gendered in a very specific direction. Doctors were almost entirely male. Nurses were almost entirely female. The doctor ordered. The nurse executed. This division was maintained with a rigidity that bore no relationship to the actual distribution of knowledge and competence on any given hospital floor, and most nurses knew this and worked within it because the alternative was conflict with an institution that held all the formal power. What nurses developed instead was a parallel expertise, a clinical knowledge and situational judgment that operated just below the level at which it would require official acknowledgement. Informing every decision while never appearing on a title or a pay stub, it was, in its way, one of the most skilled performances of invisible competence in the American workforce. And they did it in 12-hour shifts, on their feet, in shoes that offered approximately no support, and they did it because the work was real and the stakes were real, and some people are built for exactly that kind of reality. The secretary of the 1950s was, in practical terms, the operational center of most of American corporate life, and she was almost always a woman, almost always referred to as a girl, regardless of age, and almost always paid a fraction of what the men whose calendars she managed and whose correspondence she composed earned for the privilege of having their names on the letterhead. You scheduled, you typed, you organized, you remembered, you smoothed over, you anticipated. You knew everything about the office and were officially considered to know nothing. If your boss was disorganized, you were his memory. If he was inarticulate, you were his voice. If he was late, you bought his wife a birthday present, wrote the card in handwriting nicer than his, and never mentioned it. The typing speed was the entry requirement, and it was a real skill, developed over hours of practice and maintained through daily use, capable of producing 60, 70, 80 words per minute, with an accuracy that the electric typewriter of the era punished mercilessly, because errors required correction fluid, and correction fluid required time, and time, in a busy office, was not available for retyping. Pages because you had been careless. You were not careless. You had trained yourself not to be because the job required it, and because the job was what you had, and you were good at it. And being good at it was the thing you could control in a situation where most things were outside your control. The shorthand was something else entirely, a secondary language of symbols that encoded speech at the speed at which people actually talked, allowing you to transcribe dictation in real time and then translate it back into prose that was usually cleaner and better organized than what had been said out loud. Many secretaries quietly restructured their boss's thoughts into coherent arguments while appearing simply to transcribe them. This was never acknowledged. It was sometimes noticed and then unremarked upon, which is its own category of acknowledgement. The office floor was a social world, with its own geography and alliances and information networks. Secretaries knew more about what was happening in the organization than most of the men who held management titles, because information passed through the secretaries, in the memos they typed, the calls they routed, the meetings they scheduled, the conversations they were present for without being part of. This knowledge, was not power in the official sense. It did not translate into titles or compensation or decision-making authority, but it was real, and it created a kind of informal influence that operated through different channels than the organizational chart acknowledged. Some bosses were good. They were clear about what they needed, reasonable about timelines, genuinely grateful in a way that didn't require a performance of gratitude, but was just present in the daily texture of working together. They said thank you and meant it. They recommended their secretaries for better positions when those positions came up. They treated the work as work rather than as a service provided by a person whose needs were secondary to the service. These bosses were talked about among secretaries the way good restaurants are talked about among people who have eaten at a lot of bad ones, with a specificity and warmth that reflected genuine rarity. Others were not good, and the range of not goodness was considerable. The ones who shouted, the ones who took credit, the ones who considered personal errands a reasonable use of your professional time, and then failed to explain this to anyone who might have found it odd. The ones who paid attention to you in ways that required active and exhausting management. You handled all of it. You came back on Monday morning, and you handled it again. And you were called a girl, and you were paid accordingly, and somewhere underneath all of that you knew exactly what you were doing and exactly how well you were doing it, even when no one else did. One of the great underappreciated social institutions of 1950s America, particularly for single women, was the women's club, the church group, the civic organization, the professional association, the book club, the volunteer society. These organizations existed up and down the social register and served purposes that went considerably beyond their official mission statements. They were, in practice, the social infrastructure of women who had decided, consciously or not, that their community life was not going to be organized around a husband. You joined, you showed up, you brought the right dish to the potluck, and in return you got a calendar, a roster of people who expected to see you, and a reason to leave the apartment on a Thursday evening that required no further explanation. The American Association of University Women was one anchor point, particularly for women who had been to college and found themselves in professional lives that the culture had not quite figured out what to do with. Meetings were organized, substantive, oriented around ideas and civic engagement rather than the domestic topics that dominated many women's organizations of the era. You sat in a room with women who had degrees and opinions and professional experience, and the slightly energized quality of people who have found a space where their full intelligence is welcome rather than mildly alarming. These meetings were not frivolous. Policy was discussed, candidates were evaluated. The practical mechanics of civic life were engaged with the focused attention of women who understood that formal power was not available to them and were therefore very interested in the informal varieties. The church auxiliary was a different register entirely, but served some of the same functions. You organized the fundraiser, you ran the rummage sale, you coordinated the visiting program for the elderly members who couldn't easily get to services. The work was unglamorous, and it was necessary, and it was done almost entirely by women who received no official recognition for it and received something more useful instead: relationships. You knew who needed help moving. You knew whose mother had been taken to hospital. You knew which families were quietly struggling and what they needed, and how to get it to them without making them feel like charity cases. This knowledge was the social fabric of the neighborhood, and the women who built and maintained it were the people the neighborhood actually ran on. The professional women's associations, for nurses, for teachers, for women in business, offered something more explicitly career-oriented. Information about rights, about industry developments, about the quiet, legal and economic changes that were slowly accumulating in ways that would eventually matter. Women in these organizations were, in some cases, doing groundwork for changes that wouldn't be visible for another decade, collecting data, filing complaints with labor boards, writing letters, attending hearings, building the documented record that future advocates would need. They did this while also planning the annual dinner and arguing about the agenda for the next meeting, because that is how organizations function. What all of these clubs shared, beneath their different purposes and social registers, was the function of structuring time and providing belonging. You had somewhere to be. You had people who noticed if you didn't come. You had a role in something larger than your apartment and your desk, a contribution that was recognized within a specific community, even if the larger culture was not paying attention. In a social world that organized most of its belonging around the family unit you didn't have, the women's organization was the alternative architecture. It wasn't a substitute for anything. It was its own thing, and for many women it was one of the most sustaining things in their lives, worth every potluck dish and every committee meeting and every argument about the budget that lasted 45 minutes longer than necessary. Fashion in the 1950s was organized around a very specific female life narrative: courtship, engagement, wedding, honeymoon, pregnancy, motherhood, and the ongoing project of remaining attractive to a husband across all of the above. The magazines were full of advice about what to wear to attract a man, what to wear to keep a man, what to wear while pregnant, and what to wear to look like the kind of woman who had everything sorted. What the magazines did not cover, with any particular thoughtfulness, was what to wear if you were a 35-year-old woman going to work, coming home, and repeating this arrangement indefinitely. The wardrobe advice for single working women of a certain age was either the same advice aimed at younger women still in the attraction phase, which felt slightly beside the point, or the unstated suggestion that practicality was its own kind of statement. The silhouette of the 1950s was emphatic: nipped waist, full skirt, the particular hourglass emphasis that required a girdle, whether you wanted one or not, because the clothes had been designed around the girdle, and without it the silhouette didn't cooperate. The girdle was non-negotiable in most professional environments, a layer of structured discomfort that you put on in the morning along with your stockings, which required a garter belt to stay up, which required attention throughout the day to ensure they remained attached and presentable, which was a quantity of physical management that nobody seemed to consider remarkable because everyone was doing it. Getting dressed in the 1950s was an engineering project conducted under time pressure. The work wardrobe for a single woman had to accomplish several things simultaneously. It had to be professional enough to be taken seriously in an office environment that was always slightly uncertain whether to take you seriously anyway. It had to be modest enough not to attract the wrong kind of attention, which was its own navigational challenge in a workplace where the wrong kind of attention arrived regardless of what you wore. It had to last, because replacing it cost money you were spending carefully, and it had to be maintained in a state of presentation that office culture required: pressed, clean, repaired, looking like you had not been wearing it 4 days a week for 2 years, which you had. Most single women developed a small, well-chosen wardrobe organized around a few reliable pieces that mixed and matched with the efficiency of people who had learned that variety on a limited budget was achieved through accessories rather than volume. The scarves, the brooches, the single good pair of gloves that elevated the whole outfit, these were the instruments of a practical elegance that the fashion magazines, aimed at women with household budgets to draw on, rarely addressed directly. You made it work. You looked put together. People assumed this was effortless because it looked effortless, which was itself a skill acquired through years of practice. The department store was where the wardrobe was assembled, piece by careful piece, often on the sale rack, sometimes on layaway, a payment system that allowed you to put something on hold and pay for it over several weeks, a concession to the reality of limited cash flow that the store offered without fanfare and women used without embarrassment. You bought what lasted, you resisted what was fashionable but fragile. You learned, over time, that a good coat was an investment rather than an expense, and that the cheaper version cost more in the end because you had to replace it sooner. These were not glamorous lessons. They were the lessons of someone managing a material life entirely on her own terms and her own resources, and they produced a relationship with clothing that was, if not romantic, at least clear-eyed and entirely competent. Church in 1950s, America was one of the central organizing institutions of community life, and it was also, structurally, deeply oriented around the family unit in ways that the single woman navigated with practiced grace. The pews filled up with couples and children. The Sunday school organized itself around families. The church social calendar was built on events designed for pairs: the couple's retreat, the family picnic, the husband and wife Bible study that met on Wednesday evenings. You could attend all of it as a single woman, and many did, and were welcome, and contributed enormously. But there was a persistent, low-frequency awareness that you were attending someone else's architecture, that the building had been designed for a shape that wasn't yours, and you were present in it anyway, politely, determinedly, bringing a covered dish and staying for the cleanup. Sunday morning began early, and it began with the question of where to sit. This was not a trivial question. The pews organized themselves, over years of repeated attendance, into something approaching assigned seating, not officially, but practically, in the way that communities develop spatial habits. Families had their spots. Couples had their spots. You had your spot, which you had selected with the careful strategy of someone who understood that visibility in a church pew was a social experience as much as a spiritual one. Too close to the front and you were conspicuous. Too far to the back and you were invisible, which was sometimes what you wanted and sometimes not. The middle distance, slightly to one side, close enough to the aisle to leave without disruption if necessary, this was the veteran churchgoer's position, arrived at through trial. The church was genuinely important to many single women in the 1950s, not as a social performance but as a source of meaning that the secular world wasn't reliably providing. The weekly rhythm of it, the hymns, the readings, the sermon, the familiar faces, the half hour of coffee after the service where you talked to people you had known for years and caught up on the week. This was a structure that held. It was a community you belonged to by choice and by habit, and it showed up every Sunday, regardless of whether your personal life was orderly or not. There is something to be said for an institution that arrives on a schedule. The pastor's attitude made an enormous difference. Some pastors understood their congregation as a collection of individuals whose spiritual lives were their own business, and whose domestic arrangements were not a measure of their faith or their standing in the community. These were the good ones. Others organized their pastoral care around the family unit to such a degree that single women in the congregation experienced a kind of institutional afterthought, present, valued in theory, but not quite the demographic the sermons were aimed at or the programs designed for. The women who landed in the first kind of congregation found in it a genuine community. The women who landed in the second developed a useful ability to extract the parts that were meaningful and set aside the parts that weren't, which is a spiritual practice in its own right. The church auxiliary was where single women often found their most active role, because the auxiliary ran on volunteer labor, and single women had time in the evenings and on weekends that married women with children frequently did not. You organized the Christmas pageant, you visited the sick, you ran the rummage sale and the bake sale and the fundraiser for the new roof. This labor was appreciated, and it was also assumed, quietly, persistently assumed, in the way that the labor of available people tends to be assumed by the communities that depend on it. You gave it anyway, most of the time, because the work was real and the community was real, and the value of belonging to something that met every Sunday and needed you to show up was worth the occasional awareness that your contributions were being taken slightly for. Granted, most institutions run on that bargain. Church was no different. One of the quieter, more practical anxieties of single womanhood in the 1950s was the question of what happened when you got old. The social contract of the era was organized around a reasonably clear retirement scenario. A man worked, accumulated social security and a pension, and in old age was supported by both that income and the domestic labor of a wife who cooked and managed the household. A woman married, raised children, and in old age was supported by her husband's income, and if he died first, by his survivor benefits and, ideally, solvent adult children. The single woman who had worked her whole life on a woman's wages had a social security record, yes, but frequently a thin one, built on decades of pay that had been set below subsistence, on the assumption that she wouldn't need to support herself in old age because someone else would. The math was straightforward, and it was not encouraging. Social security benefits were calculated based on lifetime earnings, which meant that the gender pay gap that had followed you through your entire working life would follow you into retirement as well, translated into a monthly benefit that reflected every discounted paycheck you had ever received. If you had spent years in jobs, secretarial work, nursing, teaching, where the wages had been set low on the grounds that the work was women's work, and women's work didn't need to pay a living wage, your retirement income would reflect those wages precisely. The system was not designed to correct for the gap. It was designed to record what had happened, and what had happened was that you had been paid less, and now you would receive less. And this was presented as a neutral outcome, rather than the downstream consequence of a series of deliberate structural choices. Pensions were better at some employers than others, and some single women in the 1950s were covered by reasonably good workplace pension plans, particularly those in government employment, education, or healthcare, the reliable employment sectors for women that also happened to be among the more stable in terms of retirement benefits. But even a good pension, accumulated on a woman's wages, was modest. It was designed as a supplement to a husband's income, or, if you were widowed, to the survivor benefit from his pension. As a standalone income for a woman who had never had a husband's pension to supplement it, it was often not quite enough. The planning that single women in the 1950s undertook in response to this reality was a form of financial seriousness that the culture around them rarely credited. You could not afford the assumption that someone else would handle this. You opened the savings account and you put money in it consistently, not when it was convenient, but as a fixed commitment, before the other spending happened rather than from what was left over. You thought about the future in a way that married women were often told, implicitly, was their husband's department. It was not your husband's department because there was no husband. It was your department entirely, and you ran it with the focused attention of someone who understood that the margin for error was thin, and that the alternative to planning was considerably worse than the discipline of it. What this produced, in the women who did it well, was an old age that was more secure than the culture had intended for them, achieved through decades of careful accumulation on wages the culture had decided were adequate and were not. They owned things. They had savings. They had made decisions year by year that compounded over time into something that functioned as independence in a landscape that had not made independence easy to achieve. This was not acknowledged as an accomplishment. It was, in the fullness of time, simply their life, modest, managed, theirs. One of the more practical solutions that single women in the 1950s found for the housing problem was to become the solution themselves, to take on a larger property and rent rooms to other single women, becoming the landlady, the den mother, the keeper of the curfew, and the single bathroom schedule. These women occupied a specific and slightly complicated social niche. They were independent, entrepreneurial, in a way the era didn't entirely have vocabulary for, and they ran institutions that were quietly essential to the urban landscape of post-war America. Young women new to cities, women between jobs, women transitioning out of difficult situations, they all came through the rooming house, and the woman who ran it was simultaneously their landlady, their informal advisor, and occasionally the closest thing to a family they had in the city. The rooming house landlady was usually a widow, often a woman who had inherited a large house that was too much for one person and too valuable not to use. The calculus was practical. The house needed income to maintain, she needed income to live on, and the city was full of young, single women who needed a room. The match was obvious, and it was made, and the rooming house became a small business that the landlady ran with varying degrees of professionalism and warmth, depending on her temperament, her philosophy, and how much patience she had left by Thursday evening. The rules of the house were the landlady's rules, and they reflected her understanding of what single women's lives should look like, which was frequently conservative and occasionally reasonable. Curfews were the most common point of friction. 10 o'clock, 10:30, with a spare key policy that required formal application and was granted with the understanding that late arrival would be noted and discussed. Male visitors were restricted to the ground floor parlour, a rule that was enforced with varying enthusiasm depending on who the visitor was and whether the landlady had been having a good week. Noise after a certain hour was prohibited. Cooking in the rooms was prohibited, which was sometimes a practical safety rule and sometimes a revenue protection measure, ensuring residents used the communal kitchen and remained accountable to the communal schedule. What the good landlady provided, beyond the room and the rules, was a form of invisible infrastructure that her residents often didn't recognize until they left. She knew who wasn't eating. She knew who had been crying. She knew who had received a difficult letter that week, because the mail came through her hands first, and even unopened letters communicated something about their senders. She intervened when intervention was warranted and stayed out when it wasn't, a calibration that required more social intelligence than the role officially demanded. The landlady was also, simply by existing in her role, a model that many of her residents had not previously encountered. A woman running a thing, managing a property, making decisions, collecting money, handling maintenance, evicting the occasional difficult tenant, and doing all of it without a husband present or required. This was not discussed. It was just the shape of her life, visible and functional, and the young women who cycled through her rooms absorbed it in the background while they were busy worrying about their own lives. Some of them, years later, found themselves in possession of a house and a practical idea and a memory of a woman who had showed them, without intending to, that this was something a woman could do entirely on her own terms. The typing pool was one of the defining spatial experiences of single women's working lives in the 1950s. A large open room, usually on one of the upper floors of an office building, filled with rows of desks and the combined percussion of multiple typewriters going simultaneously, a sound that by mid-morning had become a kind of white noise, steady and relentless as rain. You sat in it. Firm. You typed. Documents arrived in baskets and left in baskets, and you were one link in a chain whose beginning and end you rarely saw. The work was repetitive in the way that repetitive work either breaks you or creates a kind of meditative rhythm, depending on your disposition, and also on how often someone came by to tell you you'd made an error. The sound of the typing pool was its own atmosphere. 30 typewriters in a room produced a collective percussion that was almost musical in its layering. The individual rhythms, slightly out of sync with each other, the bell at the end of each line chiming in irregular sequence, the carriage return a physical gesture that punctuated the sound with a mechanical finality. New employees found it overwhelming. Experienced ones stopped hearing it within a week, the way you stop hearing traffic when you live near a busy road, the sound integrating so completely into the background that its absence, on a quiet Saturday, felt strange and wrong. The supervisor of the typing pool was a figure of considerable local authority. She was almost always a woman, usually older, usually single, usually someone who had risen through the ranks of the pool itself and now occupied the slightly paradoxical position of managing the work without having been promoted out of the category that defined it. She monitored speed and accuracy. She distributed the incoming work according to a system that balanced the load and also, inevitably, reflected her knowledge of who was reliable and who needed watching. A good supervisor ran the pool with a fairness that the women under her appreciated, precisely because fairness was not something they encountered in great quantity in the larger organization. A less good one ran it as a small personal empire, and the dynamics were everything you would expect from that. The social world of the typing pool was dense and efficient in the way that the social worlds of people who spend 8 hours a day in close proximity always are. You knew everything about the women around you, their families, their romantic situations, their opinions about the supervisor, their feelings about the reorganization that had moved 3 people to a different floor and disrupted alliances that had taken years to build. Conversation happened in the spaces between work, the coffee break, the lunch hour, the 5 minutes at the end of the day when you were covering your typewriter and putting on your coat. It happened also during work, in the low murmur that the sound of the machines covered, a parallel channel of communication running just below the level at which the supervisor would need to address it. What the typing pool provided, beyond its official function, was community of a very specific kind, the community of people who share a condition. You were all there. You were all doing the same work for the same wages with the same ceiling above you, and this shared situation produced a solidarity that was sometimes explicit and sometimes just present in the way you covered for each other when someone was having a difficult day, in the way information about difficult supervisors and better opportunities circulated through the room with the efficiency of a well-maintained distribution system. Nobody organized this. Nobody needed to. It ran on the accumulated goodwill of women who understood, without discussing it at length, that they were in it together and that together was better than the alternative. There was a particular role that the unmarried woman in a family often found herself occupying in the 1950s, especially if she was the only one without a household of her own, the available one, the sister who could come for the holidays, who could stay when someone was sick, who could take the nieces and nephews for the weekend, when the married couple needed a break that they would not call a break, because that would require admitting they needed one. This was not always a burden. Many women found genuine pleasure and purpose in these relationships, in being the aunt who had time, who brought interesting things from the city, who talked to the children as if their thoughts were worth hearing. But it was also not always chosen. It was assumed, the way many things were assumed about single women, quietly, thoroughly, and without anyone thinking to ask. The availability assumption operated on a simple and rarely examined logic. You didn't have a family of your own, therefore you had time. Therefore, time-consuming tasks that required a family member were naturally directed your way. When your mother needed someone to drive her to the doctor, it was you. When your brother's wife had the baby and needed someone to come and help for 2 weeks, it was you. When the family gathering needed organizing, and your married sister was managing her own household and your married brother was managing his career, and someone needed to make the calls and coordinate the arrangements, it was you. You did these things because you loved your family, and because you were, in fact, often able to do them, and because refusing felt like confirming the worst interpretation of your situation, that you were not just unmarried but selfish, which was a charge single women of the era were particularly vulnerable to, and therefore particularly careful to avoid. The aunt role was the most genuinely rewarding of the available positions. Children, particularly at a certain age, had not yet absorbed the cultural messaging about what your life was supposed to look like, and therefore related to you without the ambient pity or the fixing impulse. You were just the aunt, the one who arrived with books and ideas and a willingness to play the board game for the 3rd time in one afternoon without sighing. You had conversations with your nieces and nephews that their parents, managing the logistics of daily family life, did not always have time for. You listened to the things they were working out about the world. You were, in some cases, the adult in their lives who treated their developing opinions as worth taking seriously, rather than as something to be managed toward the correct conclusion. The relationship with your siblings' marriages was more complicated. You were present at the edges of households that operated on rhythms and agreements you had not negotiated and could not fully read. The tension between a husband and wife, invisible to casual visitors, was apparent after 2 days to the family member sleeping in the spare room. You knew things about your siblings' marriages that they had not chosen to tell you, absorbed through proximity and observation, and you kept this knowledge carefully because nothing useful came from acknowledging it, and the family dynamics that would result from an honest conversation about it were not worth navigating. What the sister network gave you, underneath all of its complications, was continuity. These people had known you your whole life. They remembered you before you were the single one, before the label had attached, when you were simply a person in the family doing what people in families do. That memory was real, and it was yours, and it connected you to something longer than your own adult life, something that preceded the question of why you hadn't married, and would persist after that question had stopped being interesting to anyone. That was worth the 2 weeks of helping with the new baby. Most of the time, the romantic life of the unmarried woman in the 1950s existed in a cultural space defined by 2 competing and equally uncomfortable narratives. The first was that she desperately wanted to be married and had simply, tragically, not managed it yet, a framing that made her an object of sympathy and her entire emotional life a footnote to her failure. The second was that she was somehow avoiding marriage, which made her an object of suspicion, possibly selfish, possibly morally disordered in some way, That polite conversation didn't spell out, but everyone understood. What was not available, as a cultural framework, was the possibility that her situation was simply her situation, that she might have loved, might have chosen differently at certain junctions, might be entirely fine, might be complicated, might be all of these things simultaneously in the way that actual human beings generally are. Dating in the 1950s operated on a set of rules so thoroughly understood that they functioned as invisible architecture. The man asked. The woman accepted or declined. The man paid. The woman was pleasant, interested, appropriately enthusiastic without being forward, and calibrated her level of encouragement with the precision of a social engineer, because too much interest was alarming and too little was discouraging, and the correct amount required constant monitoring of a situation in which the stakes felt high and the feedback was indirect. This was considered natural and not at all exhausting. It was considered the way things worked. For single women in their late 20s and beyond, the dating situation had its own specific texture. The pool of available men had thinned in ways that were not entirely accidental. Many men of similar age were married. Others were looking for women younger than themselves, a preference the culture enthusiastically supported, with no apparent awareness of the structural problem it created for women who had simply had the temerity to age past 25. The men who were available for reasons that ranged from entirely reasonable to fairly illuminating, and navigating this required a kind of social detective work that the romance novels of the era did not address directly. The expectations around physical intimacy were a particular construction. The cultural rule was clear: respectable women did not, and respectable unmarried women especially did not. And the consequences of transgressing this rule were social rather than legal, but no less effective for that. The reputation, once questioned, was difficult to rehabilitate. The double standard was applied with a consistency that would have been impressive if it had been directed at anything worth being impressed by. Men who had exactly the kind of romantic histories that were socially prohibited to women were considered experienced, sophisticated, worldly. Women with equivalent histories were considered something else, and the something else followed them. What many single women in the 1950s actually wanted was not dramatically different from what people generally want: connection, intimacy, the experience of being known by another person with some consistency and depth. Some found this in relationships that did not fit neatly into the approved categories, and therefore could not be discussed openly. Some found it in friendships of such closeness that the distinction between friendship and love was more a matter of cultural vocabulary than lived experience. Some dated, carefully, within the constraints available, and found it occasionally wonderful and frequently frustrating and always more complicated than the magazines suggested. And some, in the quiet of their own apartments, had decided that what they had was enough, and that the life they were living was theirs, and that this was, all things considered, not nothing, and in many cases was considerably more than the culture was giving them credit for. The department store in 1950s America was, among other things, a space that single working women had quietly colonized for purposes the store had not entirely intended. On a lunch break or after work, you could walk through the floors, cosmetics on the ground level, housewares on the third, the restaurant on the top floor where women ate alone without it being remarkable, because everyone was there to eat alone, and exist in a space that was designed for women, staffed by women, and oriented entirely around the business of women's daily lives. You didn't have to buy anything. You could just be there, in the air-conditioned middle distance, among the scarves and the handbag displays, briefly invisible in the best possible way. The ground floor cosmetics counter was its own ritual. The saleswomen were expert, and they were there to sell you things, and you knew this, and they knew you knew this, and the transaction went forward anyway, because the process of being attended to, of someone asking what you were looking for, and paying close attention to your answers, and applying their expertise to your specific situation, was pleasant, regardless of whether you intended to purchase anything. You tried the lipstick, you considered the powder, you declined politely and moved on, and nothing about the interaction required you to justify your afternoon or explain your circumstances or answer questions about your plans for the future. The cosmetics counter was a small zone of uncomplicated service in a world that often required more explanation than it deserved. The housewares floor was, for single women, a space with a particular and slightly ironic quality. It was organized around the domestic life you were presumed not to have. The full sets of china for 12, the matching bedroom ensembles, the kitchen equipment for the serious home cook entertaining a family. And yet you went there, because you had a kitchen too, even if it was small, and you cooked in it, even if only for one. And the practical satisfaction of a good pot or a well-designed kitchen tool was available to people without families, just as it was available to people with them. You bought the single good knife. You bought the sensible saucepan. You bought the one nice thing for the apartment that was yours, that you had chosen, that nobody had registered for or received as a gift, that you had simply decided you wanted and acquired with your own money on a Tuesday afternoon. And this was a pleasure that the housewares floor reliably provided. The restaurant on the top floor was the crown of the enterprise. It was designed for women, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, in the way that certain spaces are designed for a particular human animal, and everyone understands this without it needing to be stated. Women ate there alone. Women ate there in pairs and groups of 3. The tables were arranged with enough space between them to permit private conversation. The menu was oriented toward lunch rather than dinner. The prices were reasonable on a secretary's budget, and the wait staff had been trained in the specific art of treating every customer as a person whose presence required no justification. You could sit for an hour. You could read. Nobody refilled your water glass with the pointed efficiency of a restaurant trying to turn the table. It was, for the duration of your lunch break, yours. The department store was the place where the city's single working women existed, briefly, as the intended population rather than the anomalous one. The whole architecture of the building was organized around them, their budgets, their tastes, their lunch hours, their small daily need for beauty and practicality, and the quiet dignity of being in a space that had been designed with them specifically in mind. It was commerce, yes, absolutely, and the store was doing very well out of the arrangement. But it was also, underneath the commerce, a form of acknowledgement, a physical space that said, without sentiment, that you were here, you were the customer, and you were welcome. Where you lived made an enormous difference to the experience of being a single woman in the 1950s. In cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, the places where large numbers of people had agreed, implicitly, to mind their own business, there was a margin of tolerance for unusual living arrangements that the small towns simply did not offer. In a city, you could be one of many single women, and the sheer volume of you made the statistical normality self-evident. In a small town, you were the spinster, singular and visible, and your status was a piece of community information that everyone held and referenced regularly, the way they referenced the price of corn or the state of the road to the next county. The city offered anonymity. The small town offered belonging, which was genuinely valuable, and surveillance, which was genuinely exhausting, and it was difficult to get one without the other. The migration of single women to cities in the post-war era was one of the quiet demographic stories of the 1950s, driven by exactly this calculus. The jobs were in cities, the anonymity was in cities. The communities of other single women, the apartments available to lease, the social organizations and the department stores and the diners that would seat you alone without commentary, all of this was in cities, concentrated and accessible in ways that rural life and small-town life simply could not replicate. Women left home and went to the city and found, often for the first time, that they were not remarkable. There were hundreds of them. There were thousands. The city had been receiving them for decades, absorbing them into its workforce and its neighborhoods, and had developed, through sheer volume, a working relationship with the single working woman that the small town had never needed to develop. The small town had compensations that were real. You knew people. People knew you, not just your current situation, but your history, the family you came from, the person you had been at 12 and 16 and 20. Before the question of marriage had become the organizing principle of how everyone understood you, this continuity was not nothing. There is something sustaining about being known in depth by a community, about the web of mutual history and shared reference that a small town produces over generations. You could not be anonymous there, which was sometimes the problem and sometimes the point. The church in a small town was a more complete social institution than its city equivalent, because in a small town, the church was one of the only institutions, and it organized more of community life as a result. Your attendance was more visible, your contributions more noted, your absence more remarked upon. This was sometimes supportive and sometimes suffocating, in a way that depended almost entirely on the specific community and the specific woman, and whether their respective tolerances happened to align. Women who stayed in small towns and remained unmarried developed a particular and underappreciated expertise in managing social visibility. You knew what to say and how to say it. You knew which questions to answer directly, and which to deflect with humor, and which to simply let pass without acknowledgement, allowing the questioner to conclude that you hadn't heard. You knew how to be present in the community in ways that were valued and recognized without feeding the narrative about your life that you found least useful. This was a social skill of considerable sophistication, and it was exercised daily, invisibly, in the grocery store and the church hall and the post office, by women who had decided that their life in this town was their life, and that they intended to live it fully regardless of the story the town had decided to tell about it. The social lives of single women in the 1950s, particularly those who had moved away from home for work, were often maintained across distance through a practice that has now been almost entirely replaced. Letter writing. You wrote to your mother. You wrote to the friend who had moved to a different city. You wrote to the college roommate who had married and moved to the suburbs, and with whom you maintained a friendship through the mail that the physical distance of your lives had made otherwise difficult to sustain. These letters were substantial, written on weekend afternoons at the kitchen table, several pages long, full of the texture of daily life, what was happening at the office, what you had cooked, what the weather was, what you were reading. They were a form of intimacy conducted at a pace that required patience, and they lasted. The telephone existed, of course, but long-distance calls were expensive enough that they were reserved for urgency, the kind of news that couldn't wait for the mail, the conversation that needed to happen in real time because the letter version would arrive too late or carry too little of what needed to be communicated. You called your mother on her birthday. You called when something significant happened, a new job, a move, a death in the family. The rest of the time, you wrote, and the writing was its own form of relationship maintenance that the telephone, for all its immediacy, did not fully replicate. A letter took time to compose. You sat down with the intention of writing, and the writing organized your thoughts in ways that thinking alone did not always accomplish. You were describing your life to someone who cared about it, which required you to look at your life with enough clarity to describe it accurately, and this periodic act of description produced a self-awareness that was useful beyond the letter itself. What was actually happening this week? What had you been thinking about? What had amused you, troubled you, occupied your attention in the hours between work and sleep? The letter asked these questions and you answered them, and in answering them you sometimes discovered things about your own life that the daily living of it had not surfaced. The friend who had moved away and married was a particular correspondent. Her life had taken the approved shape and yours had not, and this asymmetry was present in every exchange without ever needing to be named. She wrote about the children, the house, the neighborhood, the texture of a domestic life you did not have. You wrote about the city, the job, the book you had just finished, the trip you were planning. The letters crossed in the mail and arrived and were read and put away in the drawer where letters accumulated. And the friendship persisted across the gap between your lives, with a durability that the gap itself kept testing and the letters kept closing. What letters produced, over years and decades of exchange, was a record. You could go back to what you had written in 1952 and read it. And the person you had been at that desk on that Sunday afternoon was preserved in it with a specificity that memory alone does not reliably maintain. Single women who kept their correspondence, and many did, understanding perhaps that the documentary record of their lives was not going to come from wedding albums and family photographs in the approved quantities, had, in those stacks of letters, something that the culture had not provided them and that they had built themselves, a history, personal and particular, of a life that had been lived fully and in detail, regardless of the shape it had and had not taken. One of the more persistent features of being an unmarried woman in the 1950s was the assumption, maintained by nearly everyone around you with the cheerful certainty of people who have never examined an assumption in their lives, that you must be devastated about not having children. The children question was folded into the marriage question, the two treated as a single unified loss, as if marriage and children were one continuous condition that you either had or heartbreakingly lacked. The possibility that a woman might have complicated, nuanced, or even peaceful feelings about her childlessness, that she might have chosen differently given different circumstances, or might not have, or might simply not be organizing her emotional life around the absence of something she had never had, was not a narrative the culture had space for. The assumption arrived with the assumption's characteristic certainty. You must miss it. You must want it. The biological clock was not yet a phrase in common circulation, but the concept it described was thoroughly embedded in cultural thinking about women, the idea that there was a want built into female biology that produced a specific and urgent longing for children, and that a woman who did not express this longing was either suppressing it, which was sad, or lying about it, which was suspicious. That some women genuinely did not feel this longing with the intensity the culture prescribed, or felt it in ways that were more ambivalent and less consuming than the narrative required. It was not a story anyone was telling in 1953. The story was simpler and it was told everywhere, in the magazines and the movies and the casual remarks of relatives, and it said that women wanted children the way flowers wanted light, and that a woman without children was, at some level, incompletely herself. The women who worked extensively with children, the teachers, the nurses in pediatric wards, the social workers who dealt with families in difficulty, developed a relationship with other people's children that was its own thing, neither a substitute for the children they were presumed to want, nor entirely separable from that presumption. You worked with children all day. You were good at it. You cared about the specific children in front of you with a genuine investment in their well-being and their development. And when you went home in the evening to your apartment, the quality of that caring did not require you to be devastated about your domestic situation in order to be real. The work was the work. The caring was the caring. These things did not need to be filtered through grief to count. The nieces and nephews were the most direct expression of this in the private sphere. You were present in their lives from birth. You watched them develop opinions and lose teeth and fail tests, and recover from failures and grow into people who were recognizably themselves rather than the generic children they had been at 2. You loved them specifically, by name, for the particular qualities that were theirs rather than for the abstract category of child. This love was not consolation. It was the real thing, arrived at through proximity and time, and it produced relationships that lasted through the decades and provided, in old age, a web of connection that the culture had not predicted for you and that you had built anyway. One visit and one letter and one long telephone conversation at a time. Taking a vacation as a single woman in the 1950s required a specific kind of logistical creativity and social fortitude. Hotels that charged per room made solo travel notably more expensive than the same trip taken by a couple, since you were paying the full rate for a room designed for 2. Tour operators offered packages aimed at families or couples with supplements, extra charges for single occupancy that could double the cost. Some resorts were simply uncomfortable with unaccompanied women and expressed this discomfort through a range of techniques from the subtle, like repeatedly asking if someone would be joining you, to the less subtle, like room assignments that were clearly the leftovers after the real guests had been accommodated. The supplement was the particular indignity of the solo traveler's financial life. You were already paying the full room rate for a room built for 2 people. The supplement added an additional charge on top of that, justified on the reasoning that single travelers disrupted the tour group economy and the hotel room economy, and needed to be financially discouraged, or at minimum, financially penalized for their inconvenience. This was presented in the brochure without apology, buried in the fine print with the quiet confidence of a charge that expected no argument. You paid it or you didn't go, and many women decided to go, and paid it, and went anyway, and had a better time than the supplement suggested they would. The solution that many single women developed was the group tour, organized specifically for single women or for women traveling without family, a niche that the travel industry had quietly recognized and begun catering to by the mid-1950s. These tours collected single women from across the country, teachers on summer break, secretaries with 2 weeks of annual leave, nurses between hospital postings, and moved them through Europe or along the American coast or through the national parks in a group that was large enough to negotiate better hotel rates and social enough to produce genuine company. You might arrive knowing nobody and leave with friends you corresponded with for years afterward. Europe was the destination that carried the most cultural weight, and American women who saved for several years and crossed the Atlantic alone were making a particular kind of statement that they did not always intend as a statement, simply going where they wanted to go, seeing what they wanted to see, eating in the restaurants that looked interesting, standing in front of paintings that had existed for 400 years without requiring an opinion on your domestic arrangements. The freedom of being a stranger in a foreign city was, for many women, the purest version of the freedom they were assembling at home, piece by piece, against resistance. Abroad, nobody knew you were supposed to be somewhere else in your life. You were just a woman looking at a cathedral, and the cathedral, to its credit, was entirely indifferent to your marital status. The national parks were cheaper and more accessible and required a car, which single women were increasingly obtaining in the 1950s through the difficult process described in the credit section, and the sheer determination of people who had decided that mobility was not optional. You drove, you camped, sometimes, in the organized campgrounds where other families and couples looked at you with mild curiosity, and the park ranger told you which trails were appropriate for a woman alone, a designation you accepted politely and then made your own decisions about. The mountains did not care whether you had a husband. The lake did not have opinions about your situation. The road under your tires belonged to you as much as to anyone, and you drove it. The end of the workday for a single woman in the 1950s was a transition that the culture around her mostly understood as a deficit, as the moment when the married women went home to husbands and children and the real substance of their lives, and the single woman went home to the absence of those things. But the actual texture of it was considerably more varied than that framing suggested. You came home to your apartment, which was yours, which had been arranged according to your preferences without negotiation. You ate what you wanted when you wanted it. You read without someone changing the channel. You could be tired without having to also be present, attentive, and pleasant. You could be in a terrible mood about the thing that happened at the office without having to explain it to anyone. These were not consolation prizes. They were features, and some women knew this clearly, and some were still working it out, and some were genuinely lonely, and most were all three at different points in the same week. The commute home was a decompression that you managed alone, which had its advantages. You did not need to be ready to talk when you got in the door. You could sit on the bus in silence with your thoughts, letting the day settle into its proper proportions, and by the time you turned the key in the lock, you'd already done the transition that other people had to manage in the middle of an ongoing domestic situation. The apartment received you without demand. It was exactly as you had left it that morning, which was itself a small, reliable pleasure in a day full of the unpredictable. Dinner for one was a topic that the era's cookbooks had not addressed with any particular enthusiasm. Since cookbooks in the 1950s were organized around the family meal and the dinner party, and the impression made on a husband's colleagues, cooking for yourself, deliberately and without apology, was a practice you assembled from first principles, what you actually liked, what was economical to prepare in small quantities, what kept in the refrigerator for the next day's lunch. Some women cooked properly every evening. regarding the meal as worth the effort regardless of the audience. Others ate simply, the single chop and the single potato, efficient and unceremonious. Most moved between these approaches depending on the day and the energy available, and whether anyone was coming over on the weekend for whom a more elaborate production felt worthwhile. The evening was yours in a way that required getting used to, particularly in the early years when the social messaging about what the evening should contain was loudest. The radio helped, the library helped more. Single women in the 1950s read with a thoroughness that reflected both the genuinely good public library system of the era and the fact that they had evenings available for reading that were not interrupted by the competing demands of family life. The book on the nightstand got finished, the next one got started. Over years, the reading accumulated into something, a range of reference, an intellectual texture, a habit of sustained attention that produced its own rewards independent of whether anyone was watching. The loneliness, when it came, was real, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. It arrived on Sunday evenings most reliably, with the particular quality of Sunday evening loneliness that is really anxiety about Monday, repackaged in emotional clothing. It arrived in winter, when the dark came early and the apartment was quiet, and the street outside the window showed other people moving through lit windows in domestic arrangements that looked, from the outside, warmer than they necessarily were. You sat with it. You called someone, sometimes. You made tea. You went to bed and woke up on Monday morning and went to work, and the work was there, and the day was there, and the loneliness had receded to its usual background level, present but manageable, one element in a life that contained many others. This was not a tragedy. It was a life, fully and specifically lived, and it was yours. And then there were the ones who never made it a drama, who went to work, came home, cultivated their gardens, their friendships, their opinions, their small collections of interesting objects, their cats, their knowledge of the bus schedule, their regular table at the diner where the counter staff knew their order, who were not waiting for their lives to begin, and who did not speak of this because it had not occurred to them that an explanation was owed. These women existed in every city, every town, every office and church and neighborhood of 1950s America, doing the quiet work of being fully themselves in a culture that had not provided a template for it. They were not remarkable for their suffering. They were remarkable for their persistence, their wit, their self-possession, and the complete absence of any detectable interest in apologizing for the shape their lives had taken. You knew one. Everybody knew one. She was the teacher who had been at the school for 20 years and whose former students came back to visit her specifically, bypassing the principal and the other staff because she was the one who had said something to them at 14 that they were still thinking about at 30. She was the librarian who knew what you needed before you finished describing it, whose recommendations were so consistently right that people drove across town rather than use the branch closer to their house. She was the woman 3 doors down whose garden was the best on the street, who brought vegetables over in August without announcement, who fixed her own roof and knew the name of every child in a 4-block radius, and whose opinion on local matters was sought by the neighborhood association with a deference that nobody had formally arranged but everyone observed. She had not constructed her life as a defiance of anything. She had simply built it, using the materials available according to her own preferences and values, without waiting for permission or external validation or the arrival of the circumstances the culture had told her she needed in order to begin. This sounds straightforward. In the 1950s, it was a quiet form of radicalism, practiced without rhetoric or agenda, in kitchens and classrooms and gardens and offices across the country. Her relationship to the cultural messaging about her situation was pragmatic. She had heard it. She was aware of its content. She had decided, at some point, that it did not describe her actual experience and was therefore not worth organizing her interior life around. This decision was not always made once and finished. It was sometimes remade, on Sunday evenings and at holiday tables and in the doctor's waiting room, in all the places where the messaging arrived with fresh insistence and required a fresh response. She made the response and went back to her life. What she left behind was not a monument. It was not a documented resistance or a political achievement or a narrative that the history books were organized to record. It was the texture of a life lived with integrity and humor and genuine engagement with the world, and it was visible to the people around her even when it was not legible to the culture at large. Her former students remembered her. Her friends grieved genuinely when she was gone. The neighborhood was different without her, and knew it, in the particular way that communities know when someone irreplaceable has left, and cannot quite say why the absence is so specifically felt. She had not explained herself. She had not needed to. She had simply been, fully and without apology, exactly who she was, in a time and place that had arranged considerable pressure against exactly that, and had not, in the end, managed to make it stick. That was her life. It was enough. In most cases, it was considerably more than enough, and the people who had been in its orbit knew this without having to be told, which is perhaps the most honest measure of a life well lived that any of us can reasonably hope for. And so, here you are. You have travelled the full length of a life that the 1950s did not know how to name correctly. You have sat at the desk and typed the letters and eaten the dinner for one, and paid the rent on the apartment that took 3 landlords and a letter of professional reference to obtain. You have smiled at the holiday table and answered the questions with patience and brought the pie every single year and gone home afterward to the apartment that was yours, entirely yours, in a way that the era never quite intended and couldn't entirely prevent. These women were not waiting. That is the thing the culture got most comprehensively wrong about them. It looked at their lives and saw an absence, the missing husband, the missing children, the missing domestic architecture that was supposed to organize everything else, and it called the absence the story. But the absence was not the story. The story was what they built in the space the absence left open, the careers they constructed on wages designed to discourage them, the friendships of such depth and duration that they outlasted marriages twice their age, the apartments arranged exactly as they wished, the books read to the end, the trips taken alone to places that had no opinion on their marital status, the gardens, the students, the nieces and nephews who remembered them specifically, by name, for what they actually were rather than for what they had failed to become. They were not all happy. Let's not make it neater than it was. Some of them were genuinely lonely in ways that the friendships and the work and the reading did not fully resolve. And that loneliness was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than tidied away into a lesson about independence. Some of them would have chosen differently if differently had been available to choose. Some of them carried the weight of the culture's verdict about their lives with a heaviness that never entirely lifted, and that was not weakness. It was the reasonable response to decades of sustained messaging about your own inadequacy. And the wonder is not that some of them felt it, but that so many of them set it down, regularly, and got on with the day. What they left behind was not nothing, it was the groundwork. The women who came after them, who entered the workforce in the 1960s and the 1970s, with more rights and more options and more cultural permission to live on their own terms, were walking on ground that had been prepared by women who had done it without the rights and without the options and without the cultural permission, by sheer persistence and wit, and the refusal to accept that their lives were defined by what they didn't have. So tonight, as you settle into your bed in whatever shape your life has taken, partner beside you or not, children in the next room or not, the whole particular arrangement of your specific existence, maybe spare a thought for the woman at the diner counter with the book, the one who knew her order and the counter staff knew hers, and nobody was asking her to explain anything. She worked it out, in a time that made it difficult, and she did it quietly, and she did it well, and she was, in the only way that finally matters, entirely herself. That was enough. It was always enough. Now close your eyes. The world will still be there in the morning, complicated and imperfect, and full of people doing their best in the circumstances they have. Tonight there is only this, the warmth of the blanket, the quiet of the room, the soft dark that asks nothing of you except to rest. Let it carry you. You've earned it. Good night.